One of the nice things about compost is that, and this is the primary reason I compost. We know all the benefits and so on, but the primary reason I compost is because it is the most balanced source of nutrition for the plant. Now, when a plant gets all of its nutritional needs, it doesn't need fertilizer. It's like our bodies. When we get a balanced diet, we don't need vitamins. And a compost is that complete nutritional source for the plant. We don't need fertilizers. We don't have to spend the money on that. It's going to depend on how much people are committed to doing it. I mean, you could, to learn it, to do it is, a 20-minute presentation. I do that. But whether people are actually going to actively get out there and learn. Part of the learning curve is that every compost pile, every site is different, especially in the home garden. And it takes into account not only the type of materials, but the amount of rainfall and the amount of sunlight and the type of soil that's already in the garden and the type of things that are going into the compost. So all of these things are going to affect it. And when the home gardener is interacting with that, they're interacting with all these different things. So the learning curve, what they learn is good for their compost pile and so on. It takes more time. If they're doing it a lot, they're going to learn faster. No one can fail at composting. There are two types of composting. What's considered cold composting and what's considered hot composting. Now, cold composting is what Mother Nature does. Throw a pile of leaves out in the woods, it's going to rot. It's going to decompose. It's going to become compost. What hot composting is when we interact with it, when there's human intervention, when we're getting the right mix of materials in the pile, when we're making sure it has enough moisture, when we're turning it, when we're letting it get enough air. That's the hot composting. It's a lot faster, and that's what these these commercial sites and so on do. So I like to tell people that you can't fail at composting, because the minute you stop doing it, Mother Nature takes over and it will compost. Yeah, a couple of ways, couple of compost methods that I like. There's the 3-bin, where you have the freshest and so on. And I really like when people come up with their own. And two of my favorites are, one, they'll take pallets, and reusing anything I'm all about that. So they'll take pallets and they'll build the size of their compost pile with that. And I love that because it gives a lot of air. There's a lot of air around the sides of that. And again, it's reusing a product. The other one I thought was really neat, and I only saw it in a magazine. I haven't seen it in person yet. Okay, so they do the 4 posts at the corners, and then what they do is they do a chicken wire base, like a floor, about 18 inches off the ground, 18 inches to 2 feet off the ground, and they do their compost out on top of that. Well, the cool part is when the compost is ready, when it's small enough to fall through, they just scoop it out the bottom. Barrels, the turn ones are especially great for the elderly and those who have physical limitations, because it's very easy. Because composting is work, you have to get out there with a pitchfork and shovel things. So those are great. The one thing I caution people about, well, two actually, when you buy one of these bins, make sure it's made out of post-consumer recycled material. Yeah. Sounds a little odd to use, new plastic for composting. Anyway, but the other thing I recommend is 9 times out of 10, these bins don't have enough ventilation. As I said before, air is really, really important to the compost process. And if somebody buys one and finds that it doesn't have enough ventilation, I would just take a drill and add some holes. Things to keep out of compost piles, I think I touched on pesticides and so on. Meat and dairy products, they just don't break down very well. They do break down, but they don't break down very well. Another thing to keep out is pet feces. I didn't say animal manure, because things like horses, goats, cows, sheep, chickens, all that manure is great for our compost piles, but cat and pet feces contain a lot of pathogens that we don't want in our compost. Because that's the other thing. Especially, I'm a gardener, most of my garden is edibles. And if I put these pathogens into my compost pile, and then I put that compost on these plants, those plants will take up that pathogen, and then I'm putting it on my salad. People pretty much recognize that you're not supposed to put toxins and pesticides and so on into a compost pile. One disconnect that happens most of the time is that people will go out and spray their lawn, put some pesticide or herbicide on their lawn, and then a couple days later they'll mow it, and they'll take those grass clippings and throw them on their compost pile, forgetting that there's pesticides on it. The good thing is that today there are a lot of pesticides and herbicides that are made from organic materials. They're not chemical based, so they can go on that compost pile. A couple of things. One, the type of material, if there's too much of one type, especially, so say you went apple picking and you went to make applesauce, and so you have all these cores. Well, you have all this considered wet, nitrogen-rich material. This is going to take a long time to break down. It's going to get very soggy and smelly. It's going to attract rodents. So that's one thing that can happen. And then on the other end, if you have all kinds of dry materials, a pile of sawdust is just going to sit there, and it's also, if it gets wet, it's going to get lumpy, and it's not going to break down either. I wouldn't think there is one if it's being done right. I'll confess. I am in Grand Rapids, and I'll say it on camera. The Grand Rapids ordinance is such that residents can only compost yard waste. Like, even though we know that, you know, those apple cores, coffee grounds, like shells, are great to add to our compost pile, in Grand Rapids you can't do that. I live in Grand Rapids. I live in a condo. I compost, and no one knows it. Because when I'm doing it right, when people do it right, you can't know. So when you're in a densely populated urban setting, it can be done, and it can be done well. And again, I'll use myself as an example. I'm one person, so I don't generate a lot of stuff. But it can get ugly, okay, because a lot of people will collect their salad leavings and so on their countertop in a whatever, in a bag or something on their countertop. And it can get smelly. In the summertime, it can attract fruit flies, that type of thing. So I just put mine in the refrigerator. I figure, all right, so I bring this melon home from the grocery store, and I put it in the refrigerator, okay, and a day or so later I take it out and cut it up. Well, this rind has already been in my refrigerator. What's the difference between on the melon and off the melon? So I store my compost in my refrigerator, and I usually go out and do my compost pile about once a week, so I'll, you know, gather stuff through the week. And vermicomposting. One of the interesting things about vermicomposting is that it's a very specific species of worms, and they thrive on things like your apple cores and things. They can't eat what a earthworm would in your garden. In fact, if you were to switch those environments, if you were to put an earthworm into a home compost system and a red wiggler, they're commonly called red wigglers, into the garden, both would die. They really need a specific environment. But those are great too. I've seen some of those, and they're usually about this big around, and they have anywhere from 3 to 5 stacks, and it's just like anything else. It's like 3 bins of a compost, you know. So one has the freshest stuff on top, and then it goes down, and the product looks and feels like a gray clay, like something you would mold a pot out of. Again, very nutrient rich. Compost tea is interesting. That one cracks me up. So compost tea is made, no, we don't drink compost tea. It's tea for our plants. And it's really great for indoor plants. So it's created by taking your compost and putting water through it. Now, a lot of times they'll use a bubbler. But just think of like a tea bag of compost put in water, and then all those nutrients draining into the water. The thing is, as we know, those microorganisms that are so beneficial need air. They're going to drown. And so it has to be on a bubbler, and the compost tea has to be used almost immediately. So I go into a garden shop and I see these bottles of compost tea sealed. And I'm like, yeah, there's no value there. There's no nutritional value to the plant because all the microorganisms have died. The people who are too lazy to use the bins are too lazy to compost, whereas the ones who are committed to doing the compost are going to feel freer to do so. That's just my opinion. I think that's the realistic way to go. I mean, I wish it were different, but I know I wouldn't want a smelly bin in my garage. But then I don't. But then again, I put my compost in the refrigerator so that it doesn't smell. Even though I was saying earlier how Grand Rapids has this ordinance and you're not supposed to use anything other than yard waste and so on, there's no such thing as the compost police.